Welcome back, future passengers, to another dive live at the Sunken Blimp Stage. We're all very excited to introduce today's speaker. He's an extremely special guest talking about the future of architecture in the age of AI, Professor Neil Leach. And for those who don't know, Neil Leach is an architect, a curator, a writer. He's currently a professor at FIU, Tunji University, and EGS. He also taught in other leading institutions such as the AA, IAC, DIA, Columbia, Cornell, Harvard, SciArc, you name it. He's also one of the co-founders of Digital Futures, an academician in the Academy of Europe, and the recipient of 2 NASA fellowships for research into 3D printing technologies for the Moon and Mars. His research interest falls broadly into 2 fields, critical theory and digital design. In the field of critical theory, he has published a number of monographs and edited volumes, dealing largely with the impact of importing theoretical tools from critical theory into the architecture arena. So excited to have such a power mind in the stage, so without further ado, take it away, Leach.
Thank you, Matthias. I'm going to offer you something a little dystopian today, to try and draw your attention to something that I think is on the horizon and we need to address as architects. So I want to talk about a game that took place in Korea, a game that is going to have huge impact on the architectural profession, a game that potentially could lead to the death of the architectural profession, a game whose consequences we as architects need to address. But it's not Squid Game. I'm not referring to Squid Game. I'm going to refer to a game of Go, which may mean nothing to or very little to us, a game of Go between AlphaGo, a system developed by DeepMind of London, against then one of the world's greatest ever Go players, Lee Sedol, a game that took place in 2016 and which changed the world forever, even though maybe we hadn't realized it. But before I do that, I want to just kind of give some background about the age that we live in, the age of artificial intelligence. It seems that this is the dominant operation these days. We are everywhere immersed in AI apps. It's precisely what is filtering our spam on our emails. It's finishing our sentences on Gmail. It's recognizing our friends on Facebook. It's recommending us movies on Netflix, music on Spotify, books on Amazon. In the house, it's controlling our Nest thermostats, our Roomba vacuum cleaners. It's what's behind Siri, Cortana, Alexa, and so on. All the personal assistants in our cars. It's telling us if we're straying out of lane. It's telling us the quickest route to get to places. It's literally everywhere. But the important thing about AI is that it's invisible. Most people think of it in terms of robots, but robots are not AI. Robots might be controlled by AI, but they're not AI. AI is essentially software, and therefore it's invisible. It's as though the world has been colonized by a super intelligent, alien, invisible species. The question then is, what relevance does it have to architecture? AI really hit the scene, or has been around since 1956, but it really hit the scene following the deep learning revolution of about 2006. And in terms of the visual arts, it was the development of GANs, the invention of GANs, generative adversarial networks, by Ian Goodfellow in 2014 that really opened things up. And media artists immediately started playing around with this new tool. This is the work of Refik Anadol. And in many ways, this was a seminal moment when AI really met architecture, when in October 2018, they switched on 42 projectors and illuminated Frank Gehry's iconic Walt Disney Concert Hall in LA, that we began to glimpse the potential of architecture, of AI for architecture itself. Having said that, AI was a long way behind, and in many schools of architecture, AI is still not on the agenda. Maybe we can see it in the very progressive schools like the AA, like IAC or SciArc, or places where they have special people who are particularly good, such as Florida Atlantic University, the GSD, FIU, and so on, where it's on the agenda. But most people do not know about AI in architecture. And it was around 2019 that the first experimentations were taking place in how you might use AI to hallucinate architecture. This is the work of Refik Anadol again, and here is he's experimenting with style GANs and using a data set of the work of Zaha Hadid architects to hallucinate other possible buildings by Zaha Hadid architects. Even though Zaha herself is no longer with us, it's possible to use that data set and feed it into the computer, thousands of images, and out of that to start generating novel forms of architecture, interpolating novel forms of architecture. And this is really what is firing up the imagination, certainly of my students these days, in terms of the studio, but also in terms of the theory seminar. AI, these are the AI generation, the students whose career is going to be affected by most affected by the introduction of AI into the world of architecture. And AI, make no mistake about it, AI is going to completely transform architecture. It's going to be the biggest game changer that we've ever experienced. And what you begin to notice as you see this kind of latent spacewalk, at certain key moments, we see glimpsed possibilities of designs that could have been made by Zaha, but never were, but could have been made by Zaha, generated, hallucinated, synthesized by the computer itself, and all of a sudden we begin to glimpse the possibility of what this world can give for architecture. In a second then, you will see an image that is not designed by Zaha, that comes out of AI, that is quintessentially Zaha. And there it is. And that was the image that I adopted for the first book, for my book, the first book, the mainstream book on architecture in English about AI. But that's going to be followed very shortly by a bunch of other books. In fact, in the first half of 2022, there are going to be 5 other books also being published, including an issue of AD that I'm guest editing with Matthias Del Campo, Machine Hallucinations, Architecture and AI. And just for those who don't know about the capabilities of what happens, what AI can produce, this is an example. The work of Paul Pimmelblau, where Daniel Bolojan has been advising on how to use AI to hallucinate other possible buildings based on a data set of the buildings by Paul Pimmelblau. Out of that, and using not just AI, but also several other techniques, they're beginning to evolve a technique whereby you can hallucinate novel buildings that could have been designed by Paul Pimmelblau. And some of them, quite frankly, are not bad. Some of the definitions, there are a few glitches, and that's the sign of AI, but most of these designs are kind of convincing. All of a sudden, we're seeing a very novel form of architectural design, the first genuinely 21st century technique for designing architecture. This, to my mind, is going to lead to a greater revolution than even the introduction of computation into architecture itself. And it's not just the world of practice of architects themselves. Also, students are now playing around with these kind of techniques. This is the work of Giovanna Pelacca, who took a workshop last summer on digital futures on VQ-GAN and CLIP. And this VQ-GAN and CLIP is making very accessible some of these techniques. What this is based on is the logic of you can get images based on the captions related to them, and it's based on inputting certain texts and then seeing what the computer will generate. There are 2 series of prompts here. One is a series of prompts based on the names of 3 architects, Jan Sumar, Wolf Prix, and Tom Main. And then the main prompt is the simple expression, futuristic Indian temple. And what we get is something quite extraordinary. Many of those who took this workshop were kind of terrified by the capacity that you could do using this straightforward technique. It seems as though we are about to embark on a revolution in architectural design, a revolution that is facilitated by AI. But there's also a dark side to AI, and this is where I want to really focus on what the subject matter that we're addressing this time, the death of the architect, the demise of the architectural profession in the age of AI. And here I want to refer to that game of AlphaGo, a game that might seem to mean very little to us in the West, where Go is not a game, but a game that had a huge implication, huge repercussions in Asia in particular, where Go is the main game. But let me just circle back to a moment before that, in 1997, when a moment happened that many people, including Alan Turing, had predicted. Ray Kurzweil predicted it would happen before the year 2000. It happened in 1997 when Deep Blue, IBM's Deep Blue computer, beat the then world chess champion Garry Kasparov and one of the greatest chess players of all time. Nobody had expected a computer to beat someone as good as Garry Kasparov, and yet it happened. And what was interesting really was the comment that Kasparov made afterwards: everything we know how to do, machines will do better. But Go is something completely different. Go, although the moves are quite straightforward, it's an infinitely complex game in that there are more potential moves in the game of Go than there are atoms in the universe. This therefore required a shift from the expert systems that had been behind Deep Blue to learning systems, to the whole deep learning revolution that happened in 2006 to try and harness the capacity of neural networks to make this happen. And once more, nobody expected Lee Sedol to lose. Lee Sedol, one of the greatest ever Go players, nobody expected him to lose, and yet he lost. And my concern really about AI, about the dark side of AI, is not that it's evil. There's nothing evil about AI. There's nothing evil about any tool. A kitchen knife you can cut up your vegetables with. You can also murder someone. But it's the very capability of AI that makes it the case. On the left-hand side, the Korean flag, and which has the yin-yang sign in the center here. And yin-yang, in yin-yang, the white has some black in it, and the black has some white in it. So in my mind, this means that the very capabilities of AI, the very abilities of AI to do, is exactly what makes it so terrifying. And there was one particular moment in this match, one moment among several moments that were referred to as slack moves, when the real ability of AI suddenly became manifest. And the most famous one, the most iconic one, was move 37 in game 2, when DeepMind placed, when AlphaGo placed this black stone here. It was a very unusual move. You wouldn't normally put it on the 5th line. It was the first time this move had ever been made in a game of Go, and yet it had an amazing impact. 100 moves later, these two black stones linked up with this black stone, and the game was won. What was really astonishing about this is that no human being could understand this operation. In fact, they thought it was a mistake. Let me just play you a recording.
The global team was talking about is this kind of evaluation value. That's a very surprising move. I thought it was a mistake.
The point being that human beings were unable to even understand the complexity of a move. 100 moves ahead. Most Go players operate through intuition, and they operate one move at a time. But as Lee Sedol commented afterwards, AlphaGo showed us that moves humans may have thought are creative were actually conventional. AlphaGo was capable of operating way beyond the level at which humans could operate. Kai-Fu Lee, in his book about AI superpowers, where he contrasts China to the Silicon Valley, points out that this was a Sputnik moment for China. Millions were watching this in China. The original Sputnik moment happened in 1957 when the Russians sent a satellite into space, shocking the Americans and making the Americans realize that they were losing the space race. As a result of the launch of Sputnik, this Sputnik moment, they established NASA. And as a result of that, of course, Apollo 11 went to the moon and so on. The second Sputnik moment then for China was when it realized how powerful AI was, when it could thrash the best person in the world and operate at a level way beyond human beings. This led to huge investment in China, and President Xi setting the challenge to beat America by 2030. Likewise, in Korea, they woke up. This moment had a huge impact and rippled through the world. But if that was impressive, even more impressive was to come. The next model in the program was AlphaGo Zero, that was able to beat the first AlphaGo model 100 games to 0. Not only that, it taught itself to play Go through reinforcement learning without even being told the rules to play Go, without being told the rules of the game. And it did so by playing 4.9 million games of Go over 3 days. 4.9 million games of Go over 3 days against itself using reinforcement learning. Now that sounds like a lot, but when you think about it, it is really fast. This is a hummingbird beating its wings in slow motion, possibly about 2 beats per second. What AlphaGo Zero was doing was playing a game of Go against itself, 20 games of Go every second. It is simply inconceivable for us to imagine the speed at which AlphaGo Zero was teaching itself to play Go. This, I think, is the point about AI, is that we human beings cannot conceive of its capacity. On the right-hand side, Jack Ma comments, I never in my life say human beings will be controlled by machines. It's impossible. Human beings can never create another thing that is smarter than human beings. And Elon Musk replies, I very much disagree with that. The biggest mistake I see is people making is to assume they're smart. People underestimate the abilities of AI. They sort of think it's like a smart human, but it's going to be much smarter than the smartest human you will ever know. The Dunning-Kruger effect. The dumb don't know how dumb they are. We could extend that to say the intelligent don't know how dumb they are, or indeed the creative don't know how uncreative they are. We have to recognize that in terms of our intelligence, there are other entities out there that are far superior to human intelligence, just as a dog's sense of smell or hearing is far superior to that of a human being. Despite all those incredible designs coming out of Corp Himmelblau, or indeed using VQ, GAN and so on, the real game changer in architecture is going to be the software that's going to be used in the office. And here is the work of SpaceMaker AI, or the use of SpaceMaker AI in a design for a fairly conventional building project in Norway. SpaceMaker is based in Oslo in Norway, and they provide AI-powered software. Now, there's nothing special about that, but what is so interesting about what it can produce is that it effectively replicates what AlphaGo did. The whole Move 37 in Game 2 is replicated when AI comes up with suggestions that are seemingly counterintuitive, ones that no human expert would ever have imagined, and yet which prove to be far more effective than anything that we would have done ourselves. The computer is able to operate at a level way beyond human beings. And there are many designs then that came out of this, conventional in terms of their appearance perhaps, but very unconventional in terms of the way that they were generated. And out of my entire book, I would say that this is the most important comment that was made, a comment by Harvard Hochland, the CEO of SpaceMaker AI. Developers really want architects to use SpaceMaker. It is a requirement from their clients. Why do developers want architects to use AI? Because it guarantees their return on investment. It guarantees that they're going to make the maximum from their site, and that's why they want to use it. It's kind of risk management. They want to make sure they're going to get the optimum. I wanted to show you also Wan Yu He, who is the CEO of XCool. She used to work for M. Koolhaas, hence the name XCool. She's also a Doctor of Design candidate at Florida International University, and she runs a practice that has 300 people now that are developing architectural tools. This was some of the early work they did, where they begin to sort of hallucinate buildings using GANs, in many ways quite straightforward, but showing the potential of what AI could do. And most people have not been paying too much attention to XCool because much of their work has been for developers, or it's using fairly kind of straightforward modernist architecture. This is the kind of work that they're hallucinating using AI. I mean, good enough in itself, but nothing too outrageous. But more recently, they've been developing this tool and exploring the possibility of how you can use it in competitions. This was a competition about 2 years ago where they won the first round. Nobody realized it was AI that was being used to generate this project. It's as though it passed the Turing test. More recently than that, they've been exploring the possibility of how you can use environmental control AI that can then therefore generate things to make it more environmentally sustainable and produce shapes that frankly are beginning to look a little bit more like Frank Gehry. You can see on the right here this rectilinear block gradually being eroded and broken down through a kind of topological optimization process so as to achieve the optimum forms in terms of thermal comfort. And as you can see, you begin to shift from the rectilinear into sort of Gehry-like forms. This is AI computing the optimal solution. And when you bring AI together with environmental sustainability, then you have a very powerful combination. So here we are, the computer generating the forms that end up coming out looking very much like a kind of Gehry-type project. The significance of this particular project is that it won a competition, an international competition, where there were 200 different competitors from all over the world. It's almost though we only recognize the capability of AI when it can beat the very best in the world, when it can beat Garry Kasparov at chess, when it can beat Lee Sedol at Go. The ultimate challenge then for architecture, the moment when it will reach its Sputnik moment, is when AI can be used to compete against others. This is another project that's just being finished, that's just been completed, a project where XCool was competing with the very best world, with Snowhetta, with NVRDV, for a project in Shenzhen. This, you can see the AI generating the form. This has not been seen before in the West, this particular project, very new, very novel. They didn't win the competition, but they got remarkably close. It's as though they are knocking on the door, and that moment, that Sputnik moment for architecture, is about to come. The point being here, this was it was a small office of, well, there were 3 people, in fact, just doing this competition instead of 15 or so, and using AI, you could use 20% of the number of people. And it's beginning to look quite good. We're beginning to get designs to which we must pay attention to. It's as though that moment, the Sputnik moment, is about to happen for the world of architecture. We are suddenly going to wake up and discover that AI is capable of doing things beyond human capacities. The other model I want to sort of put forward is the model of the self-driving car. The important thing about the self-driving car is that potentially we no longer need drivers. Toby Walsh writes about this, and he claims that we will be banned from driving. We won't be allowed to drive cars anymore, and we will not notice or even care. And the way he puts it basically is, first of all, we'll discover how convenient self-driving is, especially when we're going out to the pub in the evening. We just get a self-driving Uber. And after a while, because we don't drive so much, our driving skills will go down. And as they will go down, so insurance premiums will go up. And because insurance premiums will go up, we will be discouraged from driving even more, and our skills will go further down until eventually we are banned from driving. And we will not notice or even care. And this is the important point. Change happens incrementally. We don't really notice it half the time. It happens incrementally. It's a bit like boiling a frog. If you want to boil a frog, they say, don't drop the frog into a pan of boiling water. Rather, put it in tepid water and gradually increase the heat, and the frog won't even notice. It won't even notice that it's being boiled. And that's the way that the world works. We don't even notice when things are being replaced. As a student at the University of Cambridge, I used to go on holidays and I would go to a travel agent. Back in the 80s, I'd go to a travel agent and I would talk to them and they would book my flight. They would send the ticket by post, by mail the next day. I would go to a camera shop. I would buy reels of films. I'd go away on holiday and then I would come back and I would send them off to be developed. Well, none of those things really happen anymore. We still have travel agents, but not many use them. Most of them book tickets online, and we certainly don't send them the tickets by post. We send them by email attachment. Camera shops have almost gone out of business because of cell phones, and we certainly don't go and have our films developed because we're all using digital cameras and so on. The world is changing, and we might not even notice. Is the same going to happen to architecture? We won't be allowed to design buildings anymore, and we will not even notice or care. The point being that AI can do them better than we can eventually, and we will be a liability. The clients are already insisting that we use AI, and why do you need to have an architect if AI can already generate that building? What happened to Lee Sedol? Well, in 2019, he gave up the game of Go with the comment that AI is an entity that cannot be defeated. Is that a presage for architecture? 50 years ago, in 1972, the book Learning from Las Vegas was published. And for some reason, people are still reading it despite the very sexist image on the front cover. 1 hour ago, literally 1 hour ago, I received an email from Routledge, and our proposal for a book, Learning from AlphaGo, has just been accepted, about how AI will transform the discipline of architecture. I'm teaming up with Daniel Bolojan, with Wanyu He, and also with Theodoros Galanas, who writes AI environmental software. Our premise is that AI is going to change architecture much more than Las Vegas ever will. Is it then game over for architects? That's the question that we need to ask. I want to suggest, though, that if we go back to Squid Game itself, there is still one person who survives the Squid Game. One person always survives, even though the others all die. And indeed, we find already in offices that one person with AI can achieve as much as 5 people without AI. In other words, for the moment at any rate, there will still be someone using AI. And I would also claim that, even though we now live in an age when we can use self-driving cars, on occasions we do this sort of thing. We have horses and carts, and for special ceremonies, for weddings, for funerals and so on. Even though it's much slower, even though it's much more expensive, we still do that. And in some senses, it's a bit like having a kind of Gucci handbag or Prada handbag. It's not because it's cheap that we have these things. In fact, it's precisely to show that we don't care about money. It's a kind of a form of conspicuous consumption to show how much money we have. And for that reason, I can imagine that Zaha herself and others, the architects, will still be employed in certain situations. But we as architects have to be able to address the situation in which we find ourselves. AI is already transforming architecture. The writing is on the wall. It will completely transform the architecture, and yet most schools of architecture around the world are completely oblivious to what AI can offer. Some people are even very negative about it. It reminds me when I was a student at Cambridge, where they banned computers from the studio for some strange reason, and all they managed to do was to generate a graduating class who were unemployable because they couldn't use computers. To my mind, what we need to design right now are not buildings, but a future for architecture, a future in which we recognize the impact this is going to have, for good or for bad, on the profession and discipline of architecture. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing now and leave it at that and open up for questions.
Wow, that was great, Leach. Thank you so much for the presentation. It's honestly mind-blowing. I had the opportunity of having you as my professor during thesis semester back when I was in university. So I know some of this what you're talking, right? Some of this what you have shared before, but every time it's still mind-blowing to see the evolution of this and kind of like the progress. And I think what really spoke to me, especially towards the end, is this idea that institutions that are preparing people for the future, right? The whole purpose of going to a university, to train yourself and fit in with the market and, literally investing into the future. Some of these institutions are not opening their eyes to what is going on technology-wise, and they're not prepared to teach and prepare their own students, right? I was even having a conversation with a colleague of mine where he described his university that they weren't learning 3D softwares, at all, and because the people in charge, the people responsible for designing the curriculum and all, they were afraid perhaps of the technology because they don't understand, therefore that's not what they want to emphasize as the most important. But then that shows that it's creating this whole generation of people that are not aware. Even being aware of this already spikes this need for change. But omitting the awareness of this is it's concerning in a way. So I'll open the floor for people that have questions. I'm sure that a lot of people might have questions for you. And one thing that I would like to ask your opinion about, which is something that I heard a lot, especially on social media, posting about this idea of AI in architecture, is the question that I keep guessing is, should I get a bachelor's or a master's in architecture? Should I go into this?
Well, I mean, you either beat them, you if you can't beat them, join them. I think that the way forward is to think about how we can involve ourselves in AI. Ben Bratton wrote a really interesting article in a book that I published, an AD, back in 2009, and it was an AD based on digital cities, and many of the contributors, almost all the contributors, were speculating about what style of architecture we would have in the future. And Patrick Schumacher was going on about parametricism as being the kind of style of the future. And there was one essay at the back by Ben Bratton that really stood out, because he basically said it was called iPhone City. What's going to change the way of architecture and urbanism is going to be things like the iPhone and the way we use informational systems to navigate the world. And he wrote this actually in 2009. He was talking about how we can now use the car as a kind of office. I mean, you can't really text in a car when you're driving these days at all. But he wrote this before Uber had been developed. And basically, the car itself can become an office. But he makes this really important point. He said, well, as of now, 50% of all architects should abandon what they're doing and start to use their architectural imaginations and invest into software and become, as it were, information architects. And I think that's the point. Architects have been obsessing about forms and the new forms. It's really about information. If you ask me what the city of the future will look like, will it look like something out of the Jetsons? I would say it's going to look pretty much what it looked like today. There are going to be a few new buildings, but essentially we're going to be retrofitting those buildings with informational systems. The traffic's going to be controlled by AI, and so on and so on and so on. We're shifting away from a discourse of form for the sake of form into an informational kind of process, whereby we're using satellites and so on, information from satellites, to understand how our society operates and to use it in that kind of way. That's the world. We need to shift our mindset from funky forms towards understanding the kind of tools that will be dictating our cities of the future. If we can use our architectural imagination to imagine a role for ourselves in a society that is completely changed, then we will find our space. I think architects have many skills that can be redeployed. I mean, we can design, we can understand material behavior, we have a huge kind of three-dimensional capacity. It strikes me that we have to begin to lock into that and really step out of the world in which we are obsessed by forms and realize that the world is changing and we need to get on board with these new technologies, because otherwise we're going to be left behind. That seems to be obvious. We've got to really change our attitude. And I would just say also that, I think that, that when we think about the structure of how we operate today in the profession, the kind of AIA, RIBA, all these institutions they're all getting increasingly obsolete. We've got a situation in the States whereby you're qualified to operate in one particular state, whereas many practices like Zahadid architects are operating internationally. We're in a system that is held back by these obsolete organizations and held back by professors who are living in the past and not aware of the things that are going to happen in the future. For your generation, not to rely on your professors, but to realize that the writing's on the wall. The fact that Sunken Blimp is operating in this way, I don't suppose there are many architects and professors who are doing these things. You have to seize the initiative and design the future for yourselves, because the future is changing.